Begin today the Gemara on Daf Chav Beis Amid Beis, in middle of the Daf, where it says Tomei Pasel. This is going back to the Mishnah, where it said that a kohen which is Tomei, and he does the Aveda, he will pasel the carbon. Zok the Gemara, Amru Ziknei Dorim. The elders from the south, in Eretz Yisrael, so they said as follows: Leishanu elatmei sheretz. This halacha of the Mishnah is only regarding a kohen which is tamei from a sheretz. It says in the Torah there are 8 different shratzim that if you touch them you become tamei. That kind of a tumah, a kohen that made the carbon will be passing the carbon. Avol tmei meis. However, if the kohen is a tamei from a meis, which is actually a more stringent tumah, but in such a case we say that mitoich shemeratze b'tzibur, since we find that this carbon will be accepted in a case of a tzibur, so nami miratze nami bi yachid. So too by a yachid this will be accepted. Okay, so let me explain what this Gemara is saying. So Rashi explains that our Mishnah here is talking about a carbon yachid, because if it's talking about a carbon tzibur, then the Mishnah would never say that a kohen which is tamei pasels the carbon, because by a carbon tzibur, l'chatchila, you're makriv the carbon even in a time of tumah, because by carbon tzibur the pasuk says b'mayadei, has to be brought in the right time. That's even b'tumah. So what is our Mishnah talking about? A carbon yachid, and it's saying that the tamei kohen that's tamei will pasel the carbon. So on this, the Ziknei Darim are saying that we find by carbon tzibur. Where do we find this by carbon tzibur? By a carbon pesach. By a carbon pesach it says b'mayadei, and that means even b'tumah. What does it mean even b'tumah by the carbon pesach? Whether you have most of the tzibur of the Yidden that are Tomei, they bring the carbon Pesach. They're only pushed off to the Pesach Sheni if it's a single person or the minority of Klal Yisrael. But if it's tzibur is Tomei, they bring the carbon Pesach. Similar, you learn out from this by B'mayadei, by the carbon Pesach, that if most of the Kayanim are Tomei, they could also be makriv the carbon Pesach. And that's the Chatchila. So therefore the Gemara is saying, just like you see that if the tzibur is tamei, that l'chatchila they could bring the carbon pesach. So we apply this also now regarding the carbon yachid, that bidi eved, if a kohen, he's not supposed to bring a carbon when he's tamei by a carbon yachid.
Tamei meis.
Yes, tamei meis, that is correct. But bidi eved, if he brought a carbon as a tamei meis, it will be meratze. The carbon will take effect. That's what the Ziknei Darim said. So therefore, the Mishnah that says that a kohen tamei will pasel the carbon must be speaking only about a tamei sheretz. A tamei meis, b'di'eved, it'll be accepted. Okay, but now the Gemara says ihachi, or actually from Rashi, he says you're not guided these words ihachi. You see Rashi's like this, none, because Rashi says that the Gemara is now asking on the whole premise that we just said, that by a tamei sheretz, when it comes to a carbon tzibur, we're not being materim l'chatchila, the kohen l'chatchila, to bring a carbon as a tamei sheretz. That's we learned from the carbon pesach. By carbon pesach, the pasuk there is actually speaking about tmei meis. It's the story there. Vayi hayu tmeim l'nefesh adam, and we said tamei sheretz you cannot bring the carbon pesach. But the question is tmei sheretz nami laisi, a tmei sheretz even by a carbon tzibur, the kohen being a tmei sheretz should be allowed l'chatchila to bring the carbon. Why? The Zevochim. With a Zevochim, which tumah is more stringent? Tmei meis or tmei sheretz? Tmei meis, that is, as the Gemara now explains. The Zevochim with tmei meis, ma tmei meis. If I see by the tmei meis, shaton azah shlishi ushvi, that you have to spray on the person to be metayidim the 3rd day of his tumah, and then again on the 7th day of his tumah. So it's a longer process of being metayidim. He has a stronger level of a tumah. Nevertheless, meratze, the kohen bringing the carbon tzibur, l'chatchila, it will be accepted. Tmei sheretz, she'enetan azah gimel shvi, the tmei sheretz that does not need this whole process of tara, he just goes to the mikveh and in the evening he's tired, and it didn't shemeratze. So definitely the kohen that's a tmei sheretz, he should be meratze, his carbon l'chatchila should be accepted. So how are we making l'chatchila this whole distinction here between tmei meis and tmei sheretz l'chatchila regarding the kohen bringing the carbon pesach? So the Gemara answers, kasavri, the Ziknei Darim, that is, they held mechaprin kemiskaprin, that the kohenim that are bringing the carbon and bringing the kapara, So that's the term here, mechapen, refers to the ones bringing the carbon, which is the kainim. Kim miskapren. They have the same halacha like the owner of the carbon, that the carbon is being brought for his sake. Ma miskapren, just like it is regarding the ones that the carbon is being brought for them, the owner. Tmei meis in tmei sheretz loi. So when do I say that if Reiv of the Tzibur is Tomei, that you could bring the carbon for them? That's only for Tumah of Meis, but not for the Tumah of a Sheretz. That does not apply by the Tzibur. Simply, the reason is, as I mentioned, because what's the pasuk talking about when it says that you can bring a carbon when it's Reiv of the Tzibur is Tomei? The whole parsha there, where it speaks about the din of carbon Pesach and then the Pesach Sheni, it's talking about Tmei Meis. So therefore, the whole halacha applies only to the Tmei Meis and not to the Tmei Sheretz. So now the Gemara is going to clarify this point in a moment. Why shouldn't we say that we should learn out with a Kavachimer to the Tmei Sheretz? The Gemara is going to explain. Okay, but again, the point the Gemara is saying is by the Miskaprin, by the owner that brings the carbon. Tmei Meis in, Tmei Sheretz lai. Only the Tmei Meis could bring the carbon, but a Tmei Sheretz cannot. Af Mechaprin, so too, the Kayin that's coming to be Mechapa for the carbon, he's doing the Aved of the carbon, Tmei Meis in. So lechatchila, by a carbon, when the tzibur is tamei, or when most of the kayanim are tamei, when could they bring the carbon? If it's a tmei meis, but tmei sheretz loy, but a tmei sheretz cannot bring the carbon. Therefore, the halacha here remains like the Ziknei Darim said, that a tmei sheretz, a kayan, a tmei sheretz that brings the carbon, it's not going to be meratze. If it's a carbon yachid, it's going to passel the carbon, and if it's a tmei meis, then it's the carbon b'di'evid is going to be accepted. Okay, now the fact that by the Tmei Meis the carbon is b'di'evid accepted is the reason is because the tzitz is meratza for this, as Rashi over here says. This is b'chlal, the whole meaning of the tzitz. We'll see some of the Gemara as well, that the tzitz is mechaper for avoyin hakadoshim. That's what it says in the pasuk. And what does this refer to? To tumah. A carbon that's brought betumah, not every kind of tumah, but certain kinds of tumah, the tzitz is meratza. So this is what the Gemara is saying here, that at kayin, at tmei meis, the tzitz will be meratza b'di'evid, but for the tmei sheretz, it will not. Okay, but now the Gemara clarifies this point itself that it just said, that we compare the mechaprin kimiskaprin, like the owner himself, just like by the owner itself, when it comes to tmei sheretz, there's no such a thing that if Reiv of the Tzibur is Tmei Sheretz, they would bring the carbon Pesach. So therefore we can't say by the Kayin that if the Kayin is Tmei Sheretz, that if he brings the carbon b'di'evet, it'll be Mechaper. Because we're comparing the two. Ashi says the reason you compare the two is because it's learned from the Pasik, the saying it's all learned from the same Pasik, where it says B'mayadoi. So therefore we compare these two together. Okay, but now the question is, Maika Savri, what is the opinion of the Ziknei Darim regarding this point that we're saying that Tmei Sheretz is a kind of tumah that b'tzibur you cannot bring the carbon Pesach if you tumah Sheretz? What do they hold? Ika Savri, if their opinion is, and as Rashi says here, at this point there is a machlokes in the Gemara in Psachim. So if they hold ein sheichten v'zarkin al Tmei Sheretz, that if there's an individual that is Tomei Tumas Sheretz. Now, what's the story with the Tumas Sheretz? He's Tomei for that day, but he goes to the mikveh, and then by night, he's already tired. So if you're going to say that even though by night he's going to be tired already, but nevertheless, since now, by day, when the carbon is being brought, you can't shecht or spray the blood of the carbon Pesach for him. Even though by night, we're talking here about the Bailam which are Tomei. You can't do that, you can't bring the carbon Pesach for him, even though by night, he's going to be fit to eat the carbon, but since now, b'shas, you're bringing the carbon, he's tamei, so that is included in what the pasuk says, ish ki yeh tamei lenefesh. Right now, he's tamei lenefesh, so you can't bring the carbon for him. So that's the story with an individual by a tmei sheretz that you can't bring the carbon for him. If so, amai lo avdi tzibur b'tumah. Why are you saying here that by the miskaprin, which means the owner, if the whole tzibur would be tamei with tumah sheretz, then they would not be able to bring the carbon b'tumah. Why not? Why shouldn't they say they can? The rule is as follows. By carbon Pesach it says, and you see this from the pasuk by the Pesach Sheni, Kol shebiyachid nitche tzibur avdi b'tumah. Any case where we're saying that the Yachid cannot bring the Pesach Rishon and therefore they're pushed off to bring the Pesach Sheni, if the same Tumah would be with a Tzibor, then they do bring the Pesach Rishon. Right, so this is learned from the Lashon of the Pasuk that it says by Pesach Sheni, Ish, and we learned that it means not Tzibor. So since he's saying over here regarding the Tumah of the Sheretz, that a Yachid does not bring the Pesach Rishon, so that should mean that if the Tzibor is Tamei Tumah Sheretz, then they should bring the Pesach Rishon. You're going to say, well, the Pasuk in the Parsha, as I mentioned before, speaks only about the Tmei Meis. It's not speaking about Tmei Sheretz B'chlal. But why shouldn't we learn with a Kal V'chaimer? Tmei Sheretz is a lighter Tumah than Tmei Meis. By Tmei Meis, you say that if the Tzibur is Tamei, they can bring the Pesach Rishon. So shouldn't we say the same should apply for Tmei Sheretz? That if it's an individual, his carbon will not be accepted. But if it's a Tzibur, then the Tzibur that's Tamei with Tumah Sheretz, they could bring their carbon. Why shouldn't we say that? So if that's the case, so then I should say the same thing with the Kayin that's Tamei with Tumas Sheretz, that B'di'evet, if he brought a carbon, that it should be Mechaper. We said before, we're comparing the Mechaperin to the Miskaperin. So the Svara should be, we should say with a Kal V'chaimer, that the owner that brings the carbon, if it's a Tzibur, Tmei Sheretz, they should be able to bring the carbon. Why not? So therefore the Gemara says, Elo, we must say, Kasavri, that the Ziknei Darim held, Sheichtin v'Zayrkin al Tmei Sheretz. That the individual that's Tamei with the Tmei Sheretz, the carbon is shechted for his sake, and you spray the blood for his sake, and then he's metayed himself, and at night he could eat from this carbon. So what does this mean? It doesn't mean that the owner themselves could come into the Beis HaMikdash during the day. He's Tamei. What does it mean? It means that he has to send his carbon with someone else, and then the Kayin will do the Avodah for him. And then later at night, he's going to eat from it. So therefore, for the Yachid, we're not saying that he's unfit to bring the carbon. So therefore, when it comes to the Tzibur, we can't say that a Tzibur that's going to be Tomei, then that they could bring the carbon Pesach and they could come into the Beis HaMikdash, because you can't apply the rule that we said before, that the Yachid cannot bring it. And then the Tzibur could bring it. No, that's not the case. Over here, the Yachid actually could bring this carbon, not himself. He sends it with somebody else. So therefore, by this heter that we say, that for the Tumas Sheretz, the Tzibur could bring the carbon, and that the Kayin, which is Roiv, if Roiv of the Kayin, and Matame B'Shum Tumas Sheretz, that they can bring the carbon, that does not apply over here. So therefore, we stick to the point that the Ziknei Darim said that by Tmei Meis we see that there's a heter for the Kayin that brings by Tmei Meis for the carbon Tzibur L'chatchila, and therefore B'di'evet for a carbon Yachid it'll also be Meratzeh. Mashenki for Tmei Sheretz we don't find such a thing. By Tmei Sheretz we don't find a heter to bring a carbon B'tumah. By carbon, also not by carbon Pesach. What you could do by carbon Pesach if you're Tmei Sheretz is you could send it with someone else. But that doesn't mean that the Kayin himself, which is Tamei B'Tumas Sheretz, could bring the carbon. So since you don't find such a heter by the Tumah of Sheretz, by a carbon Tzibur, by the Pesach, so B'di'evet, for a carbon Yachid, for Tumas Sheretz, it's also not going to work. It's going to be completely possible. And that's what our Mishnah was talking about. When it said that a Kayin, which is Tamei, is going to passel the carbon, it's speaking specifically about Tumas Sheretz, and not about the Tumah of a mace. Over there, actually, B'di'evet, that will be accepted. Okay, now Ula argues with this though. Amar Ula, but Ula says, Takalohu. The Gemara says, Ula, he protested, he screamed very vehemently, arguing with the Svara of the Ziknei Darim. So, Takalohu Reish Lakish. Ula, that is. Okay, so again, so Ula said that Takalohu Reish Lakish Lidremoi. Ula screamed and protested against the opinion of the Ziknei Darim. And he said as follows, who has the stronger koyach? Koyach mechaprin or koyach miskaprin? Is it the koyach of the ones that are bringing the carbon, or is it the koyach of the one that the carbon is being brought for him? Have a yoime, koyach miskaprin. The koyach of the one that the carbon is bringing for him, he has a stronger koyach. And this is the point that we just said, and the Gemara is going to spell it out over here, that a person that's Tamei, Tumas Sheretz, what could he do? He could actually send his carbon. Can't come himself into Beis HaMikdash, but he could send his carbon. A Kayin, which is Tamei Tumas Sheretz, cannot bring the carbon. So we see that the koyach of the miskaperin is stronger, that they're able to send their carbon. If so, why wouldn't we say the following kavachomer? If in a case when the owner was tummy with a tumah of sheretz, which is a lighter kind of a tumah, he has a stronger koyach. Why? Because mishalcha carbon is say, and they could send their carbon to be brought for their sake. And then in such a case, what do you tell me regarding this kind of tumah? But if the kohen has that same kind of tumah, ein meratza. The kohen cannot bring the carbon, and you're telling me that even with the yaved, if he brings a carbon yachid, it's going to passel. So if so, mokan shenitmu bailim b'meis, in a case where the owner has a tumah, which tumah? The tumah of meis, which is more stringent. She'em mishalchan carbon is saying. They can't send their carbon as a tmei meis. That's what the pasuk is speaking about, that they can't send their carbonis when they are tmei meis. All right, so he has to wait if 3 days and then the 7th day to be metired himself, so you can't even eat from it at all. So there's no point of him sending the carbon. You can't eat from it. It's a much more stringent tumah. So in such a case, you're going to say that koyin shenitma b'meis. So now it's again. So definitely you should say that koyin shenitma b'meis. That if the koyin is tummy with this tumah of meis, ein adin she'ein meratza. So it definitely isn't the svara that the koyin that's tummy with such a kind of a tumah that b'diavad it should not be meratza. So how can you tell me that with koyin that's tummy tumah sheretz b'diavad it's going to take effect? It's good, the carbon. But tumas meis, it's not going to take effect. But you see over here by the carbon pesach that it works the other way around. That the tumas meis is more stringent. That even the bailen cannot send the carbon at all by tumas meis. Answers the Gemara, Kesavri Ziknei Darim. The Ziknei Darim's opinion is Tmei meis nami mishalech carbon oisav. Even a kohen, sorry, not a kohen, the owner that is, that's tamei tumas meis, could send his carbon to be brought. Okay, this means even if he's tamei and he can't eat the carbon that night, he's not supposed to bring the carbon. So Rashi says what the Gemara means to say is lachatchila, he can't eat the carbon, he shouldn't send the carbon. What does he do? He brings the Pesach Sheni. But b'diavad, if he did send the carbon and the blood, the carbon was shechted and the blood was sprayed for the sake of this person that's tmei meis, it takes effect and he will not have to bring a Pesach Sheni, even though he can't eat the Pesach at night. So therefore I see, since I say that even b'diavad, the carbon takes effect for the Tmei Meis, so you can't argue and say, look, Tmei Meis is more chomer because by the miskaprin, it doesn't take effect. No, it does take effect. And therefore I could still say the point that Ziknei Darim said that by the Tmei Meis, when the kohen will bring the carbon as a Tmei Meis b'diavad, it'll be mechaper. But the Gemara asks on this, how could you say such a thing? That the carbon of a carbon Pesach for someone that's Tmei Meis, b'diavad, if you send the carbon, it takes effect. This is the whole halacha of Pesach Sheni. V'aksiv ish ki yeh tamei v'asav Pesach b'chodesh hasheni v'gaymer. This is what the parsha is speaking about. A Tmei Meis, that he can't bring the carbon, and he has to bring the Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara answers, lo mitzvah. That pasuk is only saying what the mitzvah l'chatchila is. A person that's tamei, l'chatchila, should not send the carbon to the Beis HaMikdash to be shechted and sprayed for him. Why? Since he can't eat it. And he should wait to the Pesach Sheni when he could eat the carbon. But if he did send the carbon, it will take effect for him. That's what the Ziknei Darim held. Fragt the Gemara, but regarding the carbon Pesach, it says, Ish lefi achloi, that you bring the carbon, and the whole point of the mitzvah is that it should be for those that can eat from it. So you shecht it only for those that are right to eat. And since these people that are tamei cannot eat, so then how could the carbon be shechted for their sake? So again, the Gemara says, according to Ziknei Darim, when it says this, it's all just l'mitzvah. It's only l'chatchila required that they should be able to eat, and therefore l'chatchila they shouldn't send the carbon. But b'diavad, if they sent the carbon, or Tmei Meis that sent the carbon, it will take effect, and he will not have to bring the Pesach Sheni. In fact, the Gemara is still from another source. How could you say this? The point that you have to be able to eat from the carbon Pesach, isn't that something that will prevent you of eating the carbon? Or bringing the carbon at all, that is. Tanya, we learned in the Braise, and this Braise speaks about the halacha of menuyin, that you have to have counted and appointed those people that are going to be eating from this carbon Pesach when you shech the carbon. So the Braise says as follows. It says, b'michsas nefashos, you count the people that you're bringing the carbon for them. Melamed she'ena Pesach nishchat el lemenuyav. The Pesach has to be shechted, and at the time of the Pesach has to be clear, you're counting who exactly it's shechted for. Shachta shalom lemenuyav, if you shechted for those that were not counted for this carbon Pesach, Yachel, I would think that then you over ala mitzvah. Then you were over a mitzvah lachatchila. You didn't count the people, but b'di'eved the carbon is kosher. Talmud loima. So there's another pasuk where it repeats again. It says tachaisu. It says tachaisu alaseh. So you have to count for this lamb that you're bringing as a carbon. Akasov shana olav la'akiv. The Torah says the second time to be sure that it's ma'akiv, that without counting the people when you shech the carbon, it's not a good carbon. That's what it says regarding the din of l'menuyav. Now the iskish oichlin l'menuyin, and then in the lashon of the pasuk we compare the halacha that the carbon is shechted only for those that could eat, to the halacha that the carbon is shechted for those that are counted. Because in the lashon of the pasuk tachaisu, it says that ish lefi achloi tachaisu alaseh. So it says achloi and then tachaisu. So we compare the two. So what do we see from this brayso clearly? That the fact that you have to be able to eat from the carbon is ma'akiv. So if you're a tmei meis, you can't send the carbon to be shechted for your behalf. So how are we saying it that according to Ziknei Darim, this whole concept of Tmei Meis that has to bring the Pesach Sheni is only something that is supposed to be lechatchila, lemitzvah, but b'di'evet, if they brought the Pesach Rishon, it would take effect for them. So the Gemara still argues and says that according to the Ziknei Darim lemakshi, they do not hold to this hekesh. They don't compare the din of achila to the din of l'menuyav. Like by l'menuyav, the pasuk is clearly saying it twice to be ma'akiv, but not for the din of achila. You can't eat. B'di'evet, if you brought the Pesach, you still will be yaitza. Okay, but the Gemara still doesn't accept this answer. Gemara goes back to the original question, the original Zevochim that it asked. V'chi loy makshi nami, even if you're not saying this hekesh, meha nami islu pirche, but still the same Zevochim, the same question we asked before still remains, and we just have to say it a little bit differently, but the same point is going to remain. What did the Gemara basically say now? There still is a difference between Tumas Sheretz and Tumas Meis. There is still a stringency by Tumas Meis, because by Tumas Sheretz, you could lechatchila, send your carbon to be brought, the carbon Pesach. Mashenk in Tumas Meis, lechatchila, at least lechatchila, according to the Ziknei Darim, you have to bring the Pesach Sheni. You shouldn't send your carbon. B'di'evet, if you send your carbon, it'll take effect. So we still see the stringency in Tumas Meis. If so, we could have the same Zevochim and ask the same question we asked before. If in a case where I see that if the owner becomes tummy with the sheretz, here there's no problem with their tumah. They can send their carbon to the Beis Hamikdash to be brought for their sake, and then at night they are tired and they can eat from it. So you're telling me that the Ziknei Darim say in such a case, that a kayin that becomes tummy with this kind of tumah of sheretz, when he brings a carbon with this tumah, it's not going to be accepted at all. If so, in a case where the halacha is regarding the owner, that if they became tummy with a tumas mace which is more stringent, they can't lechatchila send their carbon. Even if b'di'evet you're arguing that according to Ziknei Darim it'll take effect, but lechatchila they cannot send their carbon. Kayin shenitma b'meis ein adin she'ein meratzeh. So a kayin that becomes tummy with tumas mace, wouldn't you say that it should not be accepted? So basically we're back to the same Zevochim that the Gemara said before. We're just tweaking it and saying that we see the chumrah of tumas mace because lechatchila you're not supposed to send the carbon when you're at tmei mace. So how are Ziknei Darim making this distinction regarding the kayin that's tummy? That by tumas sheretz the tummy will be possible, and by tumas mace with the yaveh the carbon will be accepted. And here, according to some gerses in the Gemara, you have kashya. The Gemara does not answer this question. Okay, now the Gemara asks from another brayso. So the Gemara Meisvei, the Gemara asks on the Ziknei Darim, on this opinion of the Ziknei Darim, it says in the brayso. Here, this is actually, I think, a Mishnah actually, in Masechta Pesachim. So there it says that this halacha of tzitz, mentioned before, that tzitz is meratzeh for the tumah of a carbon. So it says that it's only meratzeh for the tumah of the carbon itself, but not for the tumah of tumas haguf, tumah of the body of the person. That's what it says there. Now the Mishnah explains this. And what is it speaking about there? It's speaking about the carbon Pesach. But then the Mishnah says, because they said as follows, Nazir, Vaisa Pesach, When a person which was a Nazir, and now he's completing his Naziris, and he's bringing his carbon, or a person that's bringing his carbon Pesach, Hatzitz Meratzeh al Tumas Dam. The tzitz will atone for if b'shegig there was a tumah in the blood and it was sprayed. But ve'en hatzitz meratzeh al tumas aguf. The tzitz will not atone for this, that there was a tumah in the body of the person. So now the way the Gemara understands this now is when it says here tumas aguf. Whose tumas aguf are we talking about? We're talking about the tumas aguf of the owner that brings the carbon. We're not talking about the tumas aguf of the kayin that brings the carbon, because if you were talking about the tumas aguf of the kayin, why would it be speaking specifically about a carbon of a nazir or of a carbon pesach? The issue of the kayin being tameh would be an issue by any carbon. Or over here, we must be speaking about a nazir, because a nazir could only complete his naziris when he's tired, and a carbon pesach as well. A carbon pesach he could only bring if you can eat from the carbon, if you're tired. So therefore the Gemara now is assuming that the Tumas Aguf here is speaking about the owner. And therefore this will be a question on what the Ziknei Darim say. So the Gemara explains, B'mai, when it says over here that when there's a Tumas Aguf, the tzitz will not atone for and the carbon will not be accepted, what are we speaking about? What kind of tumah that the owner has? Is it speaking about the tumah of a sheretz? But for that, the Ziknei Darim hold it's not a problem. The Ziknei Darim say that they hold like that opinion that says in Psachim that a person tummy with tumas sheretz could send his carbon pesach to be brought. So of course it's going to be accepted. You can't say that that's what the Mishnah here is saying, that the tzitz is not going to be meratzah. Ela tumas meis. It's speaking about the owner of the carbon that's tummy with a tumas meis. V'katani eina tzitz meratzah. And this Mishnah is saying that the tzitz will not atone for this. So Alma, we clearly see nitmo bailen b'meis. If the owner is tummy with a tumas meis, ein mishalchen carbon isayim. That it's saying here regarding the Pesach, that the tzitz will not be meratzah, which means that even b'diavad, if they send their carbon, the tzitz will not help for this, and even b'diavad, the carbon will not be accepted. So there's a question on the Ziknei Darim that say by the carbon Pesach that b'diavad, if he sent the carbon when he's on Tumas Meis, that the carbon will be accepted, even though he can't eat it. So it's the Gemara, loy. That's not the pshat on that Mishnah there. If the case was that the owner is the one that's telling me with this Tumas Meis, hachanami. So then, yeah, the owner, if you b'diavad sent the carbon, it will be accepted. When that Mishnah there says Tumas Aguf, that the tzitz is not meratzeh, kagayin shenitme kayin b'sheretz. We're talking about the kayin that became tamei, and what kind of a tumah is the kayin tamei with? The tumah of sheretz. Only the tumah of sheretz, which is where Ziknei Darim said that b'diavad the carbon will not be accepted. That's what it's talking about. Now Rashi just clarifies that according to this answer of the Gemara, when it says here that it's speaking about a nazir and a carbon pesach, in this halacha, it's really lav dafka nazir and carbon pesach. It's talking about any kind of carbon, and it's saying that the kohen that brings any carbon, when he's tamei tumas sheretz, it will not be accepted. Lav dafka nazir and carbon pesach. The only reason it brings up here nazir and carbon pesach is because of the hemshech of the Mishnah, as the Gemara quotes here. Says the Gemara, but if this is the case, if we're talking about tumas sheretz, aim seifa. Let's see what it says afterwards in that Mishnah. Nitma tumas atahoim. If you tell me with a tumas atahoim, which means a kind of a tumah that is under the ground and nobody knows about this tumah. If no one knows about this tumah, that falls into the category of tumas atahoim, where there's a halacha l'moishe misinai that the tzitz is meratzah. Hatzitz meratzah in such a case. And therefore, if you bring the carbon and you find out later that you were tummy with this unknown tumah, it's not going to be a problem. So what is this talking about over here? When it says tumas atahoim, it's talking about the tumas sheretz of the kayin. It's not talking about a tumas sheretz. Why not? Because Hatani Rab Chiya said, "Lo amru tumas atahoim elo lemeis bilvad." This halacha of tumas atahoim was only said for the mace, for the tumah of the mace, that this is an unknown tumah of the mace. That's halacha l'meish misinai, where the tzitz will be meratzah for this. So what does this mean? What was he saying? Only for the mace. Lemeis, when he said only for the mace, lemute mai, what is it coming to exclude? Lav, don't you think lemute tumas atahoim? It's coming to say again, lemute tumas atahoim the sheretz it is. It's coming to say that if there's an unknown tumah of the sheretz, let's say there was the sheretz somewhere in some pile of something, nobody knows about that sheretz that's there, and you stuck your hand into that pile and you have no idea that there's a sheretz, it's an unknown tumah. In such a case, the tzitz is not meratzah. So if that's the case, how could you say that the ratio of this Mishnah is speaking about a kayin became tamei betumas sheretz, and therefore when he brings the carbon, the tzitz is not meratzeh? If in the sefer of that Mishnah it says it speaks about the tumas atahayim, which does not include bichlal tumas sheretz. The halach of tumas sheretz is excluded from this. Says the Gemara, loi, that's not what we are excluding. Actually, you could say that even tumas sheretz also is included in the halacha l'Moshe Misinai of tumas atahayim, the unknown tumah. So rather, lemute tumas atahayim the ziva. There's another kind of tumah, a third kind of tumah, ziva. It's an emission from the person's body that causes a tumah, and this could also be a situation where it's unknown. Rashi says that to be tumah ziva, there has to be a re'iyah of 2 days. So what happens if it's during Ben Hashmoshes and it's not clear which day this is? Do I say now that what happened is a re'iyah of 2 days? Or maybe it's a re'iyah just of 1 day, so this is a kind of tumah which is unknown to anybody. It's a suffix that nobody could resolve. So in such a case, it's a tumah ziva that's unknown to anyone if it's actually tameh. That's the kind of tumah that the tzitz will not be meratzah for. Because the tumah ziva, Rashi says, is the most stringent kind of a tumah. It comes out of the body of the person himself. That's the only thing that was excluded. But otherwise, tumas sheretz is also included in the din of tumas atahayim. And therefore we could still say, like what Ziknei Darim say, that this Braisa is speaking about the kayin, that's Tameh, Betumas Sheretz, and then if the kayin brings the carbon, it will not be Meratzeh, but that's only by Tumas Sheretz. Okay, but now the Gemara asks on this, if so, there was a shaila that Rami Bachama asked, Kayin HaMeratzeh Bekarben Eseyim. A kayin that is bringing the carbon of a nazir and the one that's bringing a pesach. Okay, so his shaila was hutruloi tumas atahayim, aloi hutruloi tumas atahayim. Will the tumas atahayim be mutter for him, for the kayin, that if he became tamei with this tumas atahayim, will it be mutter for him or not? So this case that we're talking about right over here, this is a shaila that Rami Bacham asked. So the Gemara says, Tifshai, the tumas hatahayim hutraloi. But it should be clear that the tumas hatahayim for the kayin, not only for the owner. The shaila is that this applied to the kayin as well. But according to the pshat that we just said here in this Mishnah, the Mishnah is actually talking about a kayin in the reisha. We just explained. According to Ziknei Darim, the reisha of this Mishnah is only talking about the kayin that became tamei. It can't be talking about the bailim. Why not? Because if it's talking about the bailim, Ziknei Darim's opinion is, b'di'evet, if they sent their carbon, it takes effect. Even though they can't eat it, it takes effect. So therefore the Ziknei Darim said that this Mishnah must be speaking about what? About the kayin that is bringing his carbon. And then in the sefer of the Mishnah it says that tumas atahayim is going to be okay. So there's no room for the shaila of Rami Bachamim, because right over here, Tiv Shait, I see from this Mishnah, according to the pshat that we said, according to Ziknei Darim, that tumas atahayim hutrelai, that if there's tumas hatahayim, it'll be mutter for the kayin himself as well. The ha'hacha b'kayin kamina. We just explained that this Mishnah is speaking about the kayin. Says the Gemara, you're right. The Rami Bachame vade plige. Rami Bachame definitely has to be arguing a Ziknei Darim. According to Rami Bachame, apparently they held that Mishnah is speaking about the tumas haguf. When it said there tumas haguf in the reisha of that Mishnah, it's tumas whose guf? The bailam's guf. And therefore, the Bailim, if they are Tomei B'tumas Meis, they are themselves are Tomei, they can't send their carbon to the Beis HaMikdash. Why? Because of the reason the Gemara said in the beginning of the Yomud. Because they can't eat it. If they can't eat from the carbon, so then even B'di'eved, if they send the carbon, it's not going to work. So therefore, in the sefer of that Mishnah, when it speaks about Tumas HaTahayim, it's speaking about the Tumas Hayim of the Bailim. And therefore, Rami Bachama had an iboya about whether Tumas HaTahayim will be mutter for the Kayin as well. So that's the machlokes over here between Ziknei Darim and Rami Bachame comes out now. This machlokes here, benigeh to the Bailim that send the carbon b'di'eved. Ziknei Darim say when the Bailim send the carbon b'di'eved, it'll take effect. The whole din of Pesach Sheni is all the mitzvah, l'chatchila. But according to Rami Bachame, when the Bailim send the carbon and they're Tomei Tumas Meis, even b'di'eved, it's not going to be meratzah for the owner that sends the carbon. Says the Gemara Tashema. So now the Gemara has a question actually on Rami Bachame's opinion regarding the Bailim that send the carbon when they are Tamei, and he says that it will not be accepted because they can't eat it. So here I'll bring you a question on this from the following Braisa. It says in the pasuk V'nosa Aaron es Avayna Kadoshim that when he wears the tzitz, So this tzitz will atone for an aveda that happens with kachim. So the Braisa spells out, what kind of aveda of kachim are we talking about? Imov and pigul, are we talking about the aveda of pigul? And here Rashi explains the taich of pigul is when a person shechted the carbon and he had in mind to spray the blood in the wrong place. So then that's going to be pasling the carbon. So are you going to say that the tzitz will atone for this and it'll kasher the carbon? That can't be, because Arekvar Nemar there regarding this case, the pasuk says, Loi yichashev. It should not be considered to be a good carbon. Im oven noiser, if you're going to say that it's speaking about oven noiser, Rashi explains it means the aveda of noiser is when he had a kavaneh to eat the carbon out of its right time. That's what's usually called pigul. That's mefagel the carbon. Harei kvar nemar lo yerotze. So the pasuk already clearly says that the carbon will not be accepted. So you can't say that the tzitz is here to atone for this. So ein noise ela ovein tume shohutra miklala b'tzibur. What is it coming to be meratza for? For an aveda of tume. Why? Because we see a leniency by tume. What's the leniency? That we see that b'tzibur, there's a heter b'tzibur to bring a carbon tumah b'tzibur. That's what it's coming to be meratza for. Okay, so now the Gemara explains which tumah are we speaking about here. My tumah, when it says here this case of tumah that it sits as meratza for, what's the tumah? Ileime, the Bach takes out the meme. Ileime tumas sheretz. Are we speaking about the tumah of a sheretz? Heiche ishtiri. Where do you find that there is a tumah of a sheretz that there's a heter for this b'tzibur? We said before that if it's a yachid and he's telling me tumah sheretz, what does he do? He could send his carbon into the Beis HaMikdash. And you don't find that the tzibur themselves, if they are tamei b'tumah sheretz, a kayin that's tamei b'tumah sheretz, that he can bring a carbon tzibur. There's no heter of tumah sheretz by a tzibur. So ela tumas meis. What is it speaking about? It's speaking about tumas meis, and by tumas meis we see that if the tzibur is tamei b'tumas meis, then you could be makriv the carbon. That's where you find this leniency that hutra miklala b'tzibur. So don't you think, what are we talking about? That when we're saying that the tzitz will be meratze, kagoy shenitmu bailim b'meis, that now the owner of this carbon pesach, he became tamei with a tumas meis, and it's saying that the tzitz b'diavad, if he sent this carbon, will be meratze for him. So alme nitmu bailim b'meis. So I see from here that if the owner becomes tamei with a tumas meis, mishalchen carbon isayim, and b'diavad, if he sent this carbon, what's going to happen? It's going to be meratze for him. This is what Ziknei Darim said, that the whole din of carbon pesach sheni is only l'chatchila. You're not supposed to bring the first carbon pesach, but b'diavad, if you send it, it'll be meratze. And it seems like that's what the Braisa here is saying, that b'diavad it'll be meratze. Ubemai, now the Gemara clarifies that we must be talking about a carbon pesach, because what are we speaking about? Ibn Nazir. If it's speaking about a Nazir also brings his carbon at his completion of his Naziris, and he has to be tired. So maybe you would say that by the Nazir, when he was Tamei, that the carbon will still be meratze for him, and that's what the tzitz works for. But it can't be, because of Chiyamus, Meis, Olav, Amar Achmana, the Torah clearly says by a Nazir that if he becomes Tamei, and even if it happens suddenly and he became Tamei, that he can't complete his Naziris. He has to bring a special carbon for the tumah that happened, and he has to start his Naziris over again. So the pasuk clearly says by Naziris that if he's Tamei, he can't complete his Naziris. So Ela lo yisa Pesach. So what is it talking about? It's talking about a carbon Pesach, and it's saying l'chayda regarding the carbon Pesach that even though the owner has to be tahir, but b'diyeved, if he was tamei and he sent his carbon, this is where the tzitz is going to be meratze. So this is a question on Rami Bachame that says that since he can't eat it, it's his carbon is not going to be accepted. Says the Gemara, no, lo olam, really I can tell you b'sheretz that it is speaking about tumas sheretz. The tzitz is meratze only for tumas sheretz, not for tumas meis. By tumas meis, since he can't eat the carbon pesach, the tzitz is not going to help you. By tumas sheretz, since at night he could eat from the carbon pesach, here is where it's being meratze. Now our question was regarding tumas sheretz. How's the Braisa saying that over here the reason the tzitz is meratz is because I find a certain leniency regarding this tumah, that it's hutra miklala b'tzibur, that I find by the tzibur they can bring with tumas sheretz. Where do you find such a heter of tumas sheretz b'tzibur? There's no such thing. The answer is you're right. You don't see it by tumas sheretz, but v'shem tumah ba'olam. There is a concept of tumah in general, which is tumas meis. You see by tumas meis that the v'roiv of the tzibur is tumah, but tumas meis, then they can bring the carbon pesach. So that is also being used in the Braisa as a leniency to explain why the tzitz is meratze for tumas sheretz. But for tumas meis, according to Rami Bar Chama's opinion, the owner cannot bring the carbon, and even b'diavad, if he sends the carbon, the tzitz will not be meratze, the carbon will not be accepted because he can't eat. He can't eat from the carbon pesach. Now, others were medayik from the lashon the pasuk differently. And therefore they brought from here a question, the opposite. They actually brought from here a question on the Ziknei Darim's opinion. Again, the Ziknei Darim's opinion is that when the Bailam send the carbon when they're Tomei Tumas Meis, that b'diavad, it will be accepted. So now the pasuk says, what is the tzitz going to be meratza for? Avoin hakadoshim, for the aveda of the kachim itself. So we say like this: avoin hakachim in. If there's a problem, if there's a tumah with the kachim itself, that's where it's going to be. That's where the tzitz is going to be meratza for. But avoin magdishim loy. But if there is a problem with the makdishim, which could be either the kayin bringing the carbon or the owner bringing the carbon, so there the tzitz is not going to be meratza. Okay, so now the question is, my tumah. What kind of a tumah is it talking about over here when it's saying that the tzitz will not be meratze? So here we're being medayik fakert, that the tzitz will not be meratze for the tumah of the one bringing the carbon. If you're going to say we're talking about the tumah of sheretz, mi ishtiri b'tzibur, is tumah sheretz something that we find that there's a het to b'tzibur? Going back again to the lashon of the Braisa. The Braisa said that the reason why the tzitz is meratze for tumas sheretz, or the tumah that we're speaking about, is because we find the leniency that it's mutter to be brought b'tzibur, but we don't find such a thing by the tumah of sheretz. It's el alav tumas meis. We're talking about tumas meis. And what is the pasuk showing us? V'avoin kachamin. That only the tumah that's in the carbon itself, for example, the blood of the carbon became tumah. If there's a tumah in the carbon itself, there's where the tzitz b'diavad is meratze. But avoin magdishim loi, but the avoin, the aveda of the magdishim, of the one that's bringing the carbon, the tzitz will not be meratze for him. So who's this talking about? So Rashi here clarifies, when it says magdishim, the Gemara's diuk is not regarding the bailim. Because the bailim, according to Ziknei Darim, they hold like that opinion that says that the bailim that are tumah, they could send their carbon. All right, so that's not the point the Gemara is discussing. They could send their carbon, but what we're talking about is the Gemara says it must be elalav tumas meis. It must be speaking about tumas meis, right? So what's the problem of here? The problem is that regarding tumas meis, what did Ziknei Darim say? That tumas meis, when the kohen brings the carbon b'diavad, it is meratze. Going back to the beginning of the whole sugya, what does Ziknei Darim say? That by tumas sheretz, if the kohen brings the carbon, then it's going to be passel. Tumas meis b'diavad, the tzitz is meratze. So here the Gemara is proving that it can't be speaking about tumas sheretz because the Braisa pointed out that there's a leniency regarding tumah. Well, what's the leniency? That it can be brought b'tzibur. That leniency you don't find regarding tumas sheretz. You only find it regarding tumas meis. So therefore over here we're talking about tumas meis, and what is it saying? Avoin kachim in, avoin makdishim loy. That this tumas meis is not going to, the tzitz is not going to be meratza for this. So how did Ziknei Darim say that a kohen, which is tomei, tumas meis, that the tzitz will be meratza and b'diavad, the carbon will be accepted? Says the Gemara, loy, that's not how you have to learn this. Loy lam tumas sheretz. I could say that this pasuk and the Braisa is speaking about tumas sheretz, and only by the tumas sheretz will the tzitz be meratze, like the opinion of Ziknei Darim, v'shem tumeh ba'olam. And when it says that there's a leniency that you find regarding tumas sheretz, there is no actual leniency by tumas sheretz itself. There's only a leniency by tumas meis, but it's considered to be a leniency that applies to tumas sheretz as well, since it's the name of tumah in general. Okay, so Bekitzer comes out from this Gemara that there's two main points. There's probably more, but there's two main points that there's a machlokes over here. One is regarding the din of tomeh. The tomeh, when it says in the mission that one that's tomeh will passel, so Ziknei Darim says that that's dafke by tumas sheretz and not by tumas meis, and as the Gemara for this right over here now. And also another machlokes is regarding the carbon pesach, a person that's tomeh, and he wants to send his carbon pesach. According to Ziknei Darim, b'diavad, if he sent it, the tzitz will be meratza and the carbon will be accepted. And Rami Bar Chama says that b'diavad, that carbon will not be accepted. it's not, the tzitz is not meratza, the carbon will not be accepted. He can't eat from the carbon. So even with the Yevet, it won't be accepted. Okay, let's see one more piece regarding the next halacha in the Mishnah, Yoshev. So the Gemara had said in the Mishnah, Yoshev. Somebody that's sitting and he does the Avodah this way, it will passel the Avodah. We know long, where do we know this? Omar Rav Nachman. Yeah. So Rav says the name of Nachman, Omar Kra, the Pasuk says, Lamed L'Sharis. The beginning of that Pasuk says, that V'sheres V'shem Hashem Elokov K'cholecha V'Alavim O'imdim Sham. Sorry, I'm reading the pasuk before. Ki Voy Bochar Hashem Elokecha M'Kol Shvatecha. Hashem chose the Kohanim Lamed L'Sharis. Okay, so from this we see La'amide Bechartiv V'Loi Liyeshiva. They were chosen to do the Avodah standing and not sitting. Now, where we see that shouldn't do the Avodah sitting, but we still don't know that it would passel the carbon. So the Gemara brings a brayse. Tonder Rabbana, we learned in a brayse. Lamed l'sharis says that they have to stand and do the Avodah mitzvah. I would think that means a mitzvah l'chatchila. Kishoimer ha'imdim. When the pasuk says the word ha'imdim, shana olav ha'kosav la'akiv. So here the Torah is saying again that they have to be standing. It's in the same place. 2 psukim later, it says again ha'imdim shana l'fnei Hashem. So it tells you that it must be done standing, otherwise it'll pass all the carbon. Amalei Rav Nachman, so Rav says to Rav Nachman, Mechdi, let's see. Yoshev Kizar Dami. I see that I compare the Yoshev to a non-Kohen, or Machal Aveda, and therefore it passes the whole Aveda. If so, why wouldn't I go a step further? And Amen say, Ma Zar b'mise, just like the Zar is Chayiv Mise, when he does the Aveda, Af Yoshev, so to a Kohen that does the Aveda sitting, b'mise, he should be Chayiv Mise. Why did we learn in a brayse? Oval, Oral, Einin, Yoshev. These 4 individuals that do the Avodah, and one of them is the Yoshev. He sits and he does the Avodah, it passes the carbon, but Einan b'misa. They're not Chayiv Misa like the Zar. Why wouldn't I learn out from the Zar? And Elabaz Hara, it's a lav, they're not allowed, and it's all passel the carbon, but it's not going to bring a Chayiv Misa on them. And says the Gemara, Mishum Dahave, Mechuse Begodim, Vishaloi Rochet Yadayim V'Raglayim, Shnei Ksuvim Abom Kechad. Because the Chi of Misa we also find by another 2 psukim, by one that does not wear all his garments, and by one that did not wash his hands and feet. There the Torah says clearly that he'll be Chayiv Misa, and Mechuse Begodim is actually learned out from the Zar, that he would be Chayiv Misa. And the rule is, Shnei Ksuvim. Habam ke'echad, it's 2 psukim that say the same thing. V'chol shnei ksuvim habam ke'echad, when the Torah repeats the same thing twice, ein melamden. It's repeating it twice to let you know that it only applies in these 2 places, and I don't learn out to any other place. Ulamando amar melamden, and according to the opinion, there is one opinion that's brought in Shas many times, Rabbi Yehuda, he says that in such a case, even the Torah writes something twice, he still could learn it out to a 3rd place. So over here, I'll tell you, Shuya Yayin Havale Shlishi. The Torah says the halacha that if you serve in the Beis Hamikdash Yechayiv Misa, this is by one that drinks wine, so it's a 3rd pasuk. Ushloisha, if it's 3, L'divrei HaKoil Ein Melamden. Everybody would agree that you don't learn out from here. Now Rashi here has a question on the pshat of the Gemara. You learn the simple pshat of the Gemara. It seems like the Gemara is saying that the Yoshev that he passes the Avodah is learned from the Zar. So therefore Rashi wonders that if you are learning it out from the Zar, so then what the Gemara is saying, Shnei Ksuvim Abam Ke'echad, the Mechuse Begadim is also learned from the Zar. So what's the pshat the Gemara is saying here? Okay, so there's another Rashi from Aksav Yad, I think. You have, so the pshat that's brought regarding this, that Rashi, over here Rashi doesn't answer, Rashi doesn't explain. But the Lashon of the Gemara, when it said that the question was asking this Amalei Rav Nachman, that Yoshev Kizar Dami, the Gemara doesn't mean to say that you learn the Yoshev from the Zar. You don't learn the Yoshev from the Zar. You learn the Yoshev from what it says in the pasuk by the Yoshev itself. It says by the Yoshev, Lamed L'Sharis, then it says again, O'imdim Shana Olav HaKosav La'akiv. So that's where you learn out. It's the fact that the Yoshev passes the carbon is not learned from the Zar. It's learned from what it says by Yoshev. Elamai, then the Gemara asks, now that I know that Yoshev is pasul, because of what it says by Yoshev, I see that the Yoshev is pasul, and I see that the Zar is pasul. Why not compare the 2 and learn out the Yoshev from the Zar? And on that, that it's Chayiv Misa. And on that, the Gemara says that it's either Shnei Ksuvim or Shloish Ksuvim that you can't learn out from there. That's the pshat that Rashi says elsewhere in this Gemara.